Okay, let's pick up now with President James Monroe. We've been through the Second American War of Independence, as it's called, the War of 1812. We've made it through. We've survived and shown Europe we can't be pushed around. By the 1820s, the countries in South America, as we talked about, in part simply fed up with being exploited by Europe, and in part inspired by the American Revolution, which, don't forget, in 1830, the American Revolution was not even 50 years old. People, it was within people's lifetimes that it had happened. They looked at that and said, we want to stand up for ourselves. We can do this. And so the South American countries, if you look in 1800, all of this are colonies. The green was owned by Spain, the yellow, of course, by Brazil. The Dutch had Dutch Guiana, as it was called. The French had French Guiana, and then all of these islands in here were owned by Spain, a few by the Dutch, a few by the French, etc. By 1830, just 30 years later, the purple are free countries. And as you can see, almost all of South America is free. You still have British Guiana, Dutch Guiana, and French Guiana, but combined, they're almost smaller than Dutch Guiana alone was before. So they're greatly reduced in size. And they're really up here, if you ever look at these countries, they're really just a couple of cities along the coast. This is too dense jungle in the back to be much of anything. The British still have a little bit here. They've got Honduras. You still have some colonies in the Caribbean, but all of this has gotten its independence. So President James Monroe, of course, issues the so-called Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine says to Europe, the Americas are closed to new colonies. Now, those Caribbean colonies were still Spanish, and Monroe says, we're not going to interfere with those existing colonies. British Honduras was still British. We're not going to interfere with that. Canada, up here, doesn't show it on the map, was owned by Britain, of course. It stayed British after the American Revolution and still was. And the United States said, we're not going to interfere with that. But we are not going to allow any of these newly freed countries to be recolonized. Europe, keep your hands off, and the United States will protect it. This is a very modern cartoon about it. This is not a cartoon of the time, of course. There's James Monroe saying stop to Europe. The French, the Germans, the Spanish, the Dutch, this is supposed to be, even the Russians. Forget it. You have your fights over there. Don't bring them over here. Now, could Monroe really back it up? To some degree, the fact that Britain was behind him, and by the way, POTUS there is President of the United States. That's sometimes what in politics you refer to him as POTUS. Just like you guys have the GOAT, same idea. Anyway, could the United States have actually, backed it up with the military? We didn't have much of a military. Europe wasn't too impressed, but the British liked the idea. The British weren't planning on taking any of those countries over themselves. They didn't really have the manpower and to fight a local population there, forget it. But they liked the idea that none of these other countries would have colonies. Remember, colonies were all about wealth. And so as far as Britain was concerned, the less wealthy they were, the happier Britain was, because these were all their rivals. So the Monroe Doctrine, to take us back to it, if I can get this here. Move this over just a bit. James Monroe, who's a Democrat-Republican, a protege, a follower of James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, and whose vice president was Daniel Tompkins, a Staten Islander for whom Tompkinsville is named up on the North Shore, looks at Argentina, Peru, Colombia, Chile, Mexico all get their independence. Brazil from Spain. Brazil gets its independence from Portugal. And so Monroe says, 1, the United States has no interest in involving itself with the internal affairs of Europe. Sounds like George Washington, eh? The U.S. has no interest in interfering with any still existing colonies. But the newly freed republics are off limits to being recolonized. The Western Hemisphere is closed to further colonization, and the U.S. will be the protector of these new republics. The Western Hemisphere will be our sphere of influence, as it's called, and we will keep Europe out. This set the tone for future U.S. policy, even though Europe did not take the threat all that seriously, to be honest with you. Okay. Also under Monroe, at the same time, let's talk about this industrial and market revolution. As the Industrial Revolution takes off, so does a sort of transportation revolution. Now, the Industrial Revolution, we remember, begins with things like the cotton gin, the idea of applying scientific machinery to do work, interchangeable parts. So now, instead of craftsmen making a single chair or table or musket gun or something, you made 1,000 absolutely identical chair legs and 1,000 absolutely identical chair seats. One guy, he spent all day doing nothing but making chair legs. And then you would assemble them into absolutely uniform parts. And if a chair leg broke, you simply swapped it out for one that you had on the stack. You didn't have to have a craftsman remake a chair. That made things far more efficient and made stuff far cheaper to get. Efficiency equals cheaper, less time. But it also meant workers were often unskilled. If you are a skilled carpenter, it takes you years to learn your trade. You're very valuable because it takes you so long to get a good carpenter well trained. You are worth more money. And when you produce that chair belongs to you. You can look at it and say, I made this thing. This is what I did today. With the Industrial Revolution, it makes it easier and cheaper to get, but it also means all a worker has to know how to do is stand there and make a chair leg. I can teach you how to do that in about 10 minutes. And so the worker is as replaceable as the chair leg. He's got nothing to bargain with. He's got no particular skill. He's not that valuable. We swap him out for somebody. That robs him of an awful lot of economic power. It also means when he goes home at the end of the day and says, all right, now what did I accomplish today? He can't look at an object that he made and say, I made a great chair or a musket or a piece of glass or something. He just stood there working at a machine making table legs. And it kind of separates workers from a sense of accomplishment and purpose in their work. That's going to have implications in history a bit later on. But we notice that Industrial Revolution by the 1820s is really taking off. New ways of manufacturing, new businesses are born as new inventions get made. But notice, too, a transportation revolution. Better, faster transport, and more areas more easily connected and interacting. That's important. And finally, a market revolution. Farmer's market to sell goes from his own town or county or state to the world. And a consumer's market to buy goes from his local store to the world. In other words, as more inventions get made, they lead to better transportation. We'll see, the canal, the steamboat, which means that places that were once had not much to do with each other are now very connected. And as they're connected, if I'm selling stuff, I'm not just thinking about selling to my village. I can sell my stuff in the Ohio Valley to Europe pretty easily. And if I'm buying something, I don't have to just buy it from some local guy. I can import stuff from anywhere in the world, at least theoretically. That market revolution is also important. So we take a look at a few of the individual items. 1807, Robert Fulton works out how to use steam power to make a useful engine. Shorthand, he invents the steam engine or invents the steamboat. Okay, steam power was known from ancient time, but nobody really knew how to make it practical. Fulton figures out how to make it practical and puts it into a boat, a ship called the Clermont, which was really the first steamboat, and takes it up and down the Hudson River to demonstrate it. What's the use of a steamboat? It's not just that it can go faster, which it can, but it's not subject to weather or winds. You don't have to sail only when it's nice out, and you're not at the mercy of the current. You can go upstream and downstream just as fast, or pretty close to it. If you took a sailing ship from New York to London, it took you anywhere from about 3 weeks to about 2 or 2.5 or sometimes even 3 months. That's very unreliable. Steamboat, it was pretty reliably 2 weeks or so, and that was pretty steady. So you could predict it, you could plan it, and if you're a business guy, you love that. Another thing that happens at this time, the Erie Canal. That we've talked about a bit, as you know. So when it comes to the Erie Canal, if I can pull this in just a bit, there we go. It connected the Hudson River, and so New York Harbor, with Lake Erie, and so Ohio. So if we look at this for a minute, there is New York Harbor, the Hudson River, you get up to Albany, and the canal connects into the Hudson River right around Albany, just north of Albany at Troy. The canal goes across upstate New York and out to Buffalo and connects to Lake Erie, and once you're in Lake Erie, you're connected all the way from Michigan and almost Indiana, across the top of Ohio and even parts of western Pennsylvania. Well, what does that do for anybody? Now, if you're a farmer out here in Ohio, to go from Ohio to New York before the canal was a good 6 weeks, and it would cost you to do that transportation $100 a ton of grain, which had to be added onto the price of whatever you were selling it, or it came out of your profits. After the canal, you could make that trip from Ohio to New York in not 6 weeks, but 6 days, and it cost you not $100 a ton, but $6, $7, $8 a ton. Your cost was cut by over 90%. The canals were so successful that all these other little lines here are some of the early canals that were made in imitation. So you had immediately one that connected the Ohio River to Lake Erie, the Ohio and Erie Canal, as it's called. And then you had the Chesapeake in Ohio, you had the Susquehanna, you had the Wabash and Erie. So all of these connecting up these areas. Remember those names for just a minute. I'll come back to it in a moment. If you look at all of that, therefore, what's going to happen? You're going to get a couple of things. First of all, if you're a farmer, you're now, again, not just selling to other folks in Ohio, but selling through New York City to the world. And you can get stuff from the rest of the world through New York over the canal, and in a couple of weeks you can have it delivered. You're connected now to the world. New York was an important port. It goes from being an important port to being the most important port, because it is the connection out to the rest of the country as it existed at the time. All along the canal, you get little towns up here. Albany was already existing, but Rochester, Buffalo, and then Syracuse and Utica and all these other towns upstate. Columbus, Akron, Cleveland, out here, Cincinnati, Louisville, Kentucky, Bardstown, Kentucky, they're all going to become, small cities, because you're going to have manufacturing there, you're going to have businesses that are built around the canal, and people are going to start moving there. It also drives immigration. If I can pull this up, back where I was. So, immigration. Why? Unskilled workers are going to be needed to dig that canal and to work in the docks and in the new factories that are growing up in the small towns along the canal. The Irish, who had been prevented from having an education, the British had conquered Ireland and they basically oppressed the Irish, were looking for possibilities, looking for the ability to move out and find a better life. Well, this gave them an opportunity. Skilled workers, like skilled farmers, had accessibility to new farmland. So an awful lot of the skilled workers, Germany did not have the oppression that Ireland did. Many Germans they didn't go to college, they weren't well educated like that, but they were well trained, they had nice farms, they had crafts, they had skills. And so they came to America, with that knowledge in their head. The farmers went out to the new farmland. The craftsmen stayed in the cities. New York City's German population soars at this time, as does its Irish. The Irish are all working down on the docks and doing labor. The Germans, many of them they're opening restaurants, they're opening butcher shops, they're opening breweries, but they're also working as engineers, or they're machine tool and die makers, so machine makers, if you like, skilled jobs. By the 1830s, now the canals are giving way to the railroads. Railroads expand fast, and everything that we just said about canals is true about the railroads, only more so. Even more towns and businesses and cities grow up, and railroad hubs become key centers of population. Immigrants build the railroads and follow them out to this new expansion. So if I can pull up some of this, nope. So let's start over here, I think. So this is just a look at what this Erie Canal, part of what this Erie Canal looked like. And you see it's an artificial river. It's about 40 feet wide in most places, which is, a little wider, say, Highland Boulevard, or about the size, I guess, of Highland Boulevard. And it's only a few feet deep, because you only need enough to float that barge. And it goes like a highway through these towns. This is typical of how it worked. I can pull this in a bit. This is a canal barge back here. And you would load it up. You can see it's hugely long, not very deep, and you could pile onto it anything you wanted: grain, coal, iron, manufactured goods, corn, vegetables, whatever it was you were selling. You didn't need its own power. You had these canal mules. So you'd tie the boat to a few mules, and this is the towpath, it's called here, that ran the whole length of the canal, and the mules would just walk, and you didn't need a huge amount of power. Once you got it going in the water, you just kind of needed to give it a little bit of a shove to keep it moving. So they'd drag it along, and then at night you'd stop, you'd change mules, They'd get a rest, fed and watered, you'd stay overnight, and then move on the next day. This is a rebuilding of the original railroad. So the very first steam railroads weren't all that impressive to look at. They could carry a car or two of people or stuff. And the first railroad was the Baltimore and Ohio. You can tell from that they're trying to connect Baltimore and the Ohio River. And I think if I have here, so this was the original idea. There's Baltimore, there's Washington, D.C., this is Maryland here in Virginia. 1828, they build it out. By 1830, by 1831, they are cutting across from Baltimore out to the Potomac River. And they make a little spur down to Washington, which is the national capital and just beginning to become a place. The goal is to get out to the Ohio River, which they finally do by the 1850s. But you can see them following the line of the river much of the way here. Yeah? Well, that little thing winds up becoming this. By 1860, so within just about 30, 40 years, all of this, these red lines, these are the railroads of America. And you could see that it burst onto the scene. And all of a sudden you're connecting, New York is connected to all of the mills and factories up in New England, all of the towns in Pennsylvania, that all comes in through New York, and they connect through, following the lines of the canals out in Pennsylvania and the Erie Canal up here to take you out to Ohio. And eventually Chicago, which is right there, is going to be the western hub of all of this. So you can see the huge amount of connection that takes place. So the effect of this includes, things like immigration. Between 1820 and 1860, the blue are Irish, the red are German. So you'd see 2/3 of the immigrants are Irish or German, and then a handful of others. 1821 to 1830, you get immigration, and it may not seem like a lot compared to later, but look at the percentage increase. That goes from this to this. So how many of these do you have to stack up to get to this? You know, maybe 5 times increase by the time you get to the 1830s. And that's largely driven by the Erie Canal. Once the canal, the railroads start to be built, wow, look at this go on. It's one of the big draws. Percentage of immigrants as part of the total population. So 20% or more immigrants. That's the biggest jump. Where are they? New York, Massachusetts, and Wisconsin and Michigan. New farmland out here. So a lot of German and also, some Irish. There were some Irish who knew how to farm. Some Scandinavian, some others. They went out here for new farmland. 10 to 20% out here in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan. They're also looking for farmland. Where's the lowest number of immigrants? Less than 10% population or immigrants are the whole South. They're not going there because there's no jobs. They're all taken by the slaves. Oops. And here you can see another way of looking at the same information. 1820s to 1830s, you see Irish immigration goes through the roof. German immigration goes through the roof. A lot of English, UK, so Scotland and England. Well, they speak English, so it makes sense. Until you get up to the 1860s, 70s, and then other countries will begin to take off as immigrants. Yeah? Okay. We don't need that at the moment. So, that's this market and transportation revolution. And you can see the effect it had overall on the country. Okay, I think we'll leave it there and pick up next time with Andrew Jackson.